So given those options, who would buy a gas vehicle? Who would choose that, and why would they choose it?
Yeah, that's a great question, Tim. And I guess what I would respond to that with is there are many fuel-efficient vehicles on the road today. There are plug-in hybrids. There are internal combustion engines that get better fuel mileage than gas guzzlers. There still are gas guzzlers on the road today, and yet people are choosing those. They're still choosing, the tried and true, whatever, Dodge SRT. I mean, someone's going to call me out in the comment section about calling these cars out, but people are still choosing less fuel efficient vehicles despite there being alternatives right now. BMW as an Hi, everyone. The following is my conversation with Tim Burrows. He sits on the board of directors for EV Society. It's a not-for-profit organization here in Canada, and its mission is to utilize the expertise of electric vehicle owners to help Canadians transition to electric transportation through education and advocacy. Now, I'm sure you've seen and heard in the news that more and more jurisdictions are looking to make that EV transition very soon. California recently stated that all new vehicle purchases will either be electric or hydrogen by 2035. But the question I posed to Tim is that given the rising cost of living and inflation, and the fact that many times cars are purchased as a luxury for the average consumer, will people make that switch to electric vehicles knowing that they're more expensive and it doesn't look like their costs are going to come down anytime soon? And if consumers are not going to make that switch in the next 5 to 10 years, what will governments have to do with their potential rollout of this EV transition? We had a very spirited conversation and debate, so I'd love to know your thoughts. Let me know in the comment section below. I'll leave links to EV Society as well. Check out my newsletter and subscribe if you can. I did a newsletter about this very topic for the week of August 29th, so I'll leave a link to that as well below. But without further ado, here's my conversation with Tim Burrows. I hope you enjoy this one. Tim, thank you so much for joining me here on the Open Minds podcast. How did you land yourself in the world of EVs?
Well, it's kind of interesting. I'm a retired person now, but I was still in my working career, and it was probably about a year and a half before I ended up retiring that I just pursued an interest. I started following, in that case, it was what Tesla was doing. And, it just captured my imagination, this whole notion of being able to drive without any gasoline or diesel fuel, just with electricity. And I could envision what it would be like to be able to refuel at home and all of that. So that's sort of what drew me into it. I took the plunge and I bought an electric car, and there's been no looking back.
And Tim, what did you spend your career doing?
I was in the beverage alcohol industry and retired as a vice president at 40 Creek Distillery.
Amazing. So you probably have a lot of experience in that space. There's always that kind of one thing that pursues someone to totally change direction. And in this case, it's from buying another internal combustion engine vehicle or even hybrid. But in your case, you went straight to electric. And can you remember the one or two things that really kind of put you over the top to choose electric?
It was, I have a confession to make. It wasn't for environmental reasons. And although that's totally changed, and I hear that among electric car owners today, that they weren't always motivated to buy an electric for purely environmental reasons. A lot of people do, but in my case, I confess it wasn't that. It was, again, the whole ownership experience. And I just kept thinking about what it would be like never having to go to a gas station again. And I kept thinking what it must be like to drive a car that doesn't have an internal combustion engine, so it would be quieter and there'd be no vibration or sound. It was those sorts of elements, I think, that drew me into it.
Why do you think this topic, EVs, is so divisive? It seems like people have very strong opinions, either for or against. The comment section on YouTube and many other social media channels are just littered with people who have very strong opinions. Why do you think that is? is it because that it's such a drastic change from internal combustion engines?
I think that there is no one answer to that question. I've met a lot of folks, and I know the people you're speaking of, and people who are just anti-electric cars.
Yeah.
And often if you explore, you'll find that there are a couple of reasons why they might feel that way. Most often it's because of a lack of understanding and a lack of knowledge. And so most of us are kind of stubborn, right? We don't like change unless we're forced into it. And then nobody likes to be forced into anything.
Yeah.
So, I think there are a lot of different reasons. What I can tell you with absolute certainty is that the vast, vast majority of folks who make the plunge, take the plunge and buy an electric vehicle, they would never, ever think about going back. It is a very different experience and a very positive experience. And so almost nobody would ever go back to internal combustion.
Tim, I want to ask, I know we're going to get into a lot more in this podcast, but, talking to my folks, talking to a lot of people, one thing that they're concerned about, especially in Canada, are the winters. And I want to ask you, as an EV owner yourself, you've experienced a lot of winters, much more than myself. How has your EV experience been in the coldest and harshest months of winter?
Yeah, certainly in Canada, the environment plays a role in how we drive and own and use our vehicles. And I've had now, I believe, if I do the count, it's 8 or 9 winters driving a purely battery electric car.
Wow.
My first battery electric was a rear-wheel drive car, and that was a bit of a scary experience because, like most folks, I'd gotten used to. I mean, in the old days, we all had rear-wheel drive cars, but front-wheel drive became the norm, and it frightened me to think, oh, I'm going to go back to rear-wheel drive, and it's electric car and all the rest of it. But it turns out, the reason front-wheel drive became popular is in winter driving is because you have a great big heavy gas or diesel engine sitting right over the front axle. And so that helped with traction. But in an electric car, the weight distribution is pretty much even. It's kind of 50-50. And therefore, there's no big advantage to front wheel drive. So the rear wheel drive car was really good, the electric. I did put on really good winter tires. And of course, I recommend that for anybody driving in our winters. The second vehicle I've owned, and the one I still drive today, happens to be all-wheel drive, so it's great. So that's the driving characteristic answer to your question. Christopher, you also asked about, I think you're implying about what about cold temperatures and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So there is a bit of a learning curve. There's no doubt that cold temperatures will reduce the efficiency of electric car battery so that you can't draw out all the energy that's in there if it's allowed to get really, really cold. And so you will find an impact on the driving range. And there are ways to mitigate that. I'll mention that in a second. But under the worst circumstances, you might see as much as a 40% range drop. That's if your car is stone cold. Wow. It's a bitter cold day. And you're driving through snow, so there's rolling resistance against the wheels.
Yeah.
But we can mitigate that. And those of us who own electric cars, the typical use case, we leave our cars plugged in. Like that's what's recommended. It's good for the car and good for the battery, just to leave it plugged in when you're not using it.
Wow.
And what we can do then is in the morning, if I'm going to go out on a bitterly cold day, I'll just take out my phone and there's an app for my car and I'll just precondition the battery in the cabin while it's still plugged in. So that when I pull out on that frigid morning, I'm all toasty and warm and I don't take that big range hit that you might otherwise experience. So there are ways around it, and it has not been any problem at all in my 8 or 9 winters, whatever it's been. It's been fine. There's a learning curve, and that's okay.
Tim, for such a dramatic shift technologically that we're seeing from internal combustion engine vehicles to electric, that learning curve is very steep, and that probably facilitates the divisiveness we see online, the comment section, because there doesn't seem to be a coordinated strategy to help the consumer through that learning curve. We could depend on the manufacturer to provide some specifics to the vehicle, but the more broad questions like, your range may be affected in cold weather, and here's how to mitigate that. Do you think that there's a role for some type of public agency, government body to further that information amongst the general public to encourage more uptake of electric vehicles, do you think?
I don't know that it's necessarily the government's role to do that. Certainly, there would be opportunities along the way when we're talking about electric vehicle stimulus programs. There probably are opportunities along the way for the government to be a provider of information. Mm-hmm. Certainly, the Electric Vehicle Society, of which I'm a member, takes that as one of our major pillars. That's one of the main things that we try to do, and that is educate people and help them with that learning curve. It isn't. I mean, it's not a big thing, but it is different. And as to your point, it's maybe a little bit intimidating for some folks. But that's what EV Society does. We try to educate and inform about the benefits of electric vehicles.
Yeah, and the reason I asked that question is because I still remember. It's getting a bit foggy now, but I still remember my G1 test and my G2 test, which are driver's license tests here in Ontario. And, the instructor was looking down to make sure I put it in reverse. I always put it in drive, and my signals, they were always looking at the gauge cluster and making sure that I was always looking at everything as well. In some of the newer EVs, the gearbox is not in the traditional location. In some other EVs, it's not there at all. It's actually just on the screen. That learning curve may have a kind of public implications, go for a driver's test in an electric car, or, having an Uber or a taxi operate an electric vehicle. There may be a need for a government body in some way to kind of help along that learning curve in addition to what EV Society is doing.
Well, I'm not sure I totally agree with that. I think you're, I feel that you're being a little bit overly concerned about that learning curve. I think the learning curve is relatively simple, and I agree that it's probably part of what makes some people shy away from electric vehicles, but it really is not that much. I mean, it's not that difficult.
So can you tell me a little bit about what EV Society is doing and your role on the board?
Sure. So EV Society, for those folks who aren't familiar with it, is a not-for-profit organization that we have something on the order of 2,000 members and affiliates Canada-wide. It's a Canadian not-for-profit. And our goal is to help facilitate the adoption of electric transportation, not just cars, mostly cars, but certainly trucks and other types of machinery and equipment that moves people around. We do that through, as you'll hear a lot about, and I've already referenced, through education, because we see that as a major issue at the moment. And we also do it through advocacy. So those of us who are able to do it reach out to government at different levels and help them, because the government is making decisions and they need information to make informed decisions. And so we try to be there to do that as a group of owners of electric vehicles.
That's fascinating. And I'm glad that the EV Society exists for that reason in particular, because I do think that there still is some reticence towards EV adoption. And I know there's many reasons for that. What would you say are some of the major concerns outside the technological gap or the perceived change that, like a gearbox selector, things like that, that people are saying, you know what, I'm not just ready yet for an EV. I'll stick to an internal combustion engine or a hybrid at most?
Sure. Well, there, as you allude, there are a lot of reasons, but some of the big ones that I hear about most frequently, one is concerns over the range.
Yeah.
Now, it's the early EVs certainly had pretty limited range, and while they're still totally appropriate for city driving, if that's some people, that's all they do is they motor around in a city or a big town. But if you want to take road trips, you need bigger, more range. Unfortunately, as EVs have evolved, they're now being delivered with more and more range to make long trips. And there's a charging infrastructure that's filling out now to enable that as well. But one of the big misconceptions about, and I had this, so I know I went through it with my first EV, was wondering whether the range was going to be enough, because of the kind of driving I was doing. I was actually in sales at that time. I was a vice president of sales at a distillery. And I wondered whether the car would have enough range to take care of my business and working needs.
Wow.
But one of the things that I learned very quickly, I mean, I knew it intuitively, but I learned it for real, is that when you are able to plug your car in every night, just like your smartphone, right? Like your cell phone, you plug it in and the next day when you go to use it, it's full.
Yeah.
And if you think about that in terms, for those of the people listening who drive a gasoline car, if you had somebody sneaking into your driveway and filling up your tank every night, no matter how much you used during the day, they still topped it up every single night. Think about how long it would be before you ever need to go to a gas station.
Right.
And that is the experience with electric car owners. We wake up every morning to a full tank. And it's only on those occasions that we take really long trips that we ever have to think about charging sort of in the wild. It's far less than most people think. Now, they want the idea that I can get in the car and drive to Florida. They want to be able to know that they can do that. But if you ask them, well, when are you planning to do it? I go, well, I don't really have a plan to do that, but I want to be able to if I ever did. There's that kind of thing. But charging every day or every night is remarkable. And it takes care of all but maybe 5% of your driving needs. So that's a big misconception. And another quick one, of course, is we talked about cold weather. That's a biggie. Charging infrastructure, as I explained, you'll use chargers out in the wild far less than you think you will. You need to have them when you need them, but that's pretty rare. What I do think about are the folks who live in condominiums and apartment buildings. And for them, there are special challenges. With condominiums, there's a whole process. There is a roadmap. If you are a condo owner and you want to put a charger next to into your parking spot, there is a procedure for that. And the cost will certainly vary depending on a bunch of things, but primarily where your parking spot is relative to the electrical panel of the building. In terms of capacity, there's software companies now out there that specialize in load management so that you could get a whole bunch of electric cars in an older condo getting the charging done overnight without overloading the system. I think something like a quarter to a third of Canadians live in multi-unit residential buildings, and so they're the ones that face this. And finally, if they don't have that opportunity to put in a charger for any reason, they're going back to the old gas model where they have to drive somewhere to refuel and then come home again.
So, Tim, I had a question for you, and that's on this question of recharging and the fact that, people are worried about the charging infrastructure for non-Tesla owners in particular. The charging infrastructure in Canada, at least, it's much better than it was a few years ago, but certainly not there by any stretch. It's not so much, and one thing, a person commented on one of my articles and they said, I have a Chevy Bolt. It's a hybrid, I believe, but I never fill it up because I do all city driving and it just uses the battery 100% of the time. I can't remember the last time I filled it up with gas. But still, it's that perception, the perception of, well, I don't know if I run out of charge, I'm going to be stranded. And that anxiety, that range anxiety seems to be the overlapping concern, regardless of, helping individuals know that you can charge at home. Unless you're doing long drives, you'll need it. On the rarest of occasions, if you only do long drives a few times a year, that's when you'll need it. that doesn't seem to resonate with consumers as much as this anxiety that, again, overlaps all of these. Why do you think that is, that it's taking the EV society, and I'm not kind of speaking on behalf of EV society, but it's taking this concerted effort to educate the consumer on this, on their behavior and why their concerns may be misguided?
Yeah. Well, it still comes back to just education and knowledge. As I say, after all the winters I've been driving an electric car, I only I scared myself once, I think, in the first winter. The cars themselves are brilliant, and I think this spans pretty much all makes and models of EVs today. They're wonderful in the sense that they provide you with very clear information about the state of your charge and available range. And the only thing I can say, there's no way to give somebody the experience. They have to find out for themselves. But what I can say is that, if you are a person who frequently runs out of gasoline, then you have reason to be concerned about getting an EV, because it's going to be harder to deal with that kind of a thing. But if you don't run out of gasoline, and I don't know, I haven't run out in a long time, then you won't run out of electricity either. Your car tells you your status. The nav system tells you what you'll have when you get to the destination that you've entered. It's all very clear and transparent. And unless you're asleep at the switch and not paying attention, you're never going to run out.
Tim, do you think that, though, that range anxiety is warranted, given the winters, as we just discussed? Yes, there's ways to mitigate the range going down in the winters, but upwards of, let's say, 20 to 30% range loss. I know my phone very well, and it says 100%, and then depending on the winter conditions, it can drop down. Do you think that range anxiety is warranted in those specific cases where it's minus 30 out, your battery says it's 100%, you go for your typical commute, you might pick up the kids and all that, and you come home, or you may not know how much you have left to do groceries and other errands. Do you think there's merit in that argument?
I can't argue with how people feel, but is it justified? No, it's not. Again, a little bit of experience and just living with the car for a few weeks, you will understand its behavior, and that fear, that range anxiety dissipates. Like, it just goes away. Ask anyone who drives any electric car and has been driving them for a reasonable period of time about range anxiety. I don't think you're going to find anybody who says, "Oh, I'm still concerned. That's still top of mind every time I get it." It goes away because you learn the characteristics of the vehicle and you become very comfortable with it.
That's really fascinating. Thanks for that, Tim. I brought you on to discuss the current cost of living crisis that we're all going through with high inflation. And it's no secret, electric vehicles are more expensive than internal combustion engine vehicles. Before I ask you more about a recent Deloitte study that looked at consumer choices, I want to ask, do you think there's merit in government incentives to help bring down the costs of electric vehicles, similar to what they're doing in the United States, specifically for consumers who are trying to make that decision? Maybe it's their first vehicle, or they're trying to graduate from their first vehicle, but still entry-level Teslas, for example, are still pretty expensive, and they may be going up some more. Is there merit in government incentives to helping consumers make that decision?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that so this comes back to a fundamental question about how urgent you think climate change is. And that kind of, to me, at least to me, it links back to the question of, well, then how much, if you really believe this is a crisis that we're facing that needs to be actioned quickly, then you want to accelerate the adoption of electric vehicles because they represent, close to a third of the greenhouse gases that we're trying to get rid of. If you don't think climate crisis is a concern, then you might take the argument, well, the government really doesn't need to get involved. Electric cars are better, and people are going to find that out on their own eventually, but it's just going to take a lot longer. So I tie it back to that question. But to in general terms, yes, I think there's a role for governments to play in incentivizing the purchase of electric vehicles, but you need both a carrot and a stick.
Hmm.
So the carrot is incentives for consumers to take the sting out of the sticker price. But you also need to work with the manufacturers and help incentivize in some fashion their choices and the pace of change that they're going to adopt. And you'll see in some provinces in Canada and places in the US, they have something called ZEV mandates, of course, zero emission vehicle mandates, where manufacturers are required to produce a certain percentage of their total fleet as zero emission. And that target increases, it ramps up every year going forward. So there's the stick, and then the carrot is the purchase incentives. But I would like to point out, and we have in Canada a $5,000 rebate federally for providing there's a bunch of technicalities to it, but providing the vehicle is available in some form at $45,000 or less. You can get a dressed up one and pay more and still get the $5,000, but it has to be out there at least. Then there are provincial incentives on top of that in some provinces, Quebec and BC most notably, and now a couple of the Atlantic provinces have jumped into it. And on top of the $5,000 federal, you can get a provincial rebate. I think these things are important. I would like to point out, however, that if you do the math today and compare electric cars to some comparable gas versions, what you'll find is that if you keep your car for 6 to 8 years, that you will make that premium back in cost savings. It already is cheaper to drive an electric vehicle. It's the total cost of ownership that you have to consider. All the maintenance, all the fuel, all of that. Now, I appreciate that for some folks looking at, kicking tires in the car lot, that they still have to deal with that sticker price, and they may not be able to get there with their available budget. So there's where the incentive really helps to get them over that hurdle.
Tim, given your background in the distillery and being the vice president of sales, you probably know better than anyone that consumers are very much concerned with, well, what have you done for me lately, kind of thing. And that delayed gratitude is really hard. Governments always struggle with tax incentives, right? Because it's only at tax time that you can do the write-offs and things like that. And that delayed gratitude isn't immediate. Do you see merit in, I've always said this, and I don't know if the governments are doing this, but I want to ask you, are they applying that rebate at the time of purchase, or is it something that someone will need to file their taxes and say, oh, Christopher, you bought an EV in, last year, here's your rebate now? Is it at the time of purchase? Because I know that's a big distinction for consumers as well.
Yeah, it varies. Essentially, and I have to just give the caveat that I haven't purchased an EV lately. So rules may have changed slightly, but in my experience, at the time of purchase, an application was filed for me to receive the rebate. Had nothing to do with my income at the time. It was just you had to fill out the paperwork. The manufacturer, in my case, filled out the paperwork on my behalf and submitted it, and then I got the money later. Some dealerships, I've heard, will do that instantly, give you the $5,000 at the moment you drive off the lot, and then they wait for the money to come to them. They get the rebate, essentially. I think in the United States, the model, by and large, is it's an income tax related, it's a tax reduction, right? So it's based on your income, and that's, you would have to file to get that. But no, to my knowledge, in Canada, that isn't the way it's done.
I want to go back to something you said about climate change and zero emissions vehicles. I think I've seen that sticker, that license plate around on Toronto here as well. And I had a conversation with Vaclav Smil. I've tried so hard to get him on the podcast. He has refused several times. But one thing he mentioned to me was that he worries about the phrase zero emissions because depending on your jurisdiction and where you're charging up, there are emissions that go into the electricity generation, and especially for Midwest United States. Do you think that term can be a bit misleading for consumers? Because, if we really want to be philosophical, like who made, there was emissions in the metal production, there was emissions in the fabric that, coats the seats. Is it kind of, should we get away from that phrasing? There are emissions that go into making these vehicles, and depending on where you live, charging up also requires emissions to be produced.
Yeah, I don't think we need to get away from the term. I think it needs to be accurately applied. So if we're talking about the vehicle itself being a zero emission vehicle, I think that's pretty clear. If you want to talk about emissions during manufacture, then you also have to go back to the petrochemical industry and look at the emissions and the energy required to mine and process and then ship oil and fuel. There's a you have to sort of look at the whole cradle to grave. And there's no doubt, electric cars have an environmental footprint too, certainly on the mining side of things. There is an environmental footprint. There's no denying that. But the one big advantage that people sort of don't think about with electric vehicles is that even if you are in some jurisdiction that's still getting its electricity from coal, the cars aren't dirtier. They're still cleaner than a comparable gas, but just not by very much. But the good thing is, if we do move the fleet over to electric vehicles, as jurisdictions clean up their energy grid, the fleet gets cleaner with it. And so we know that everybody, pretty much everywhere, is trying to get into more renewables. They're trying to find ways to reduce emissions in energy production. And as they do that, if we're all still driving gas cars, it won't matter at all. Yeah. But if we do switch over to electric, we'll get cleaner along with the grid.
Right. Tim, going back to the cost aspect, because I think that's what determines consumer choice more than anything. It seems people, that old saying, people vote with their wallet, not necessarily with their hearts. In a recent Deloitte study, they found that cost was the second biggest concern when it comes to electric vehicles, first being range, which we discussed. 77% of respondents want a vehicle under $50,000. And right now, there's just not enough options, especially for Canadians at that price point. And so making that switch, and again, even if you do buy an electric vehicle at and or around 50 grand, it's still like that entry level. Whereas for internal combustion engines, they've had the time in the market, and usually at that price point, you're getting something a little bit more than the base model. What can you say to kind of help consumers make that switch, knowing that they're paying in some cases 30 to 40% more than a comparable internal combustion engine vehicle?
Yeah, well, it shouldn't be 30 to 40% more as a starting point. If because of all the supply chain problems that the whole automotive industry is facing and inflationary costs, if you look now, the average cost of a gasoline car in Canada is almost $51,000. That's the average cost of a gasoline vehicle in Canada. Right. And so the electric vehicle is not that far off. But again, folks have to look at the total cost of ownership. I mean, you start clawing. So there are a lot of comparisons you can make of gas to electric cars that are cheaper almost right out of the gate. Yeah. It doesn't take long to earn that cost differential back because of the low cost of running them. So, I mean, that's the only thing I would stress about that. And the prices are coming down. I mean, it's very unfortunate that we've hit this, time of turmoil, supply chain issues, inflation, at a time when electric vehicle adoption had already started to really ramp up. I mean, I could see it happening before COVID and before all of this happened. And so now you've got the perfect storm because everybody wants an electric car. Or I shouldn't say that, but huge number of people have realized the benefits of, and they can't get one because they're not sitting on the lot. So it's, as an EV enthusiast and promoter of electric cars, it's kind of a frustrating time to watch that unfold. But the pent up desire is going to be there, and it's as soon as they can supply. Most of the mainstream electric vehicles, things like the Ford F-150 Lightning and and I can't think of them, but some others
Yeah.
that would be top of mind. The companies have actually stopped taking orders for them because they know they can't make them for a reasonable period of time. And so they don't want to disappoint people.
Right.
The demand is there. It's just now ramping up supply.
Yeah. And, that's one of the big questions that I'm sure EV Society wrestles with as well, is that when undertaking these massive technological changes, supply chain is so critical. It's too critical because there are so many moving parts to developing an EV. It's not just retrofitting factories. It's also, in some cases, making entirely new factories because of the battery production and the moldings that are needed for electric vehicles. Do you see that there's anything that large, again, I always come back to governments because, again, I think if this is going to be a major shift that's led by governments through incentives and, phasing out of internal combustion engines, should they not have a role to play in helping manufacturers with those supply chain issues?
Well, yeah, I think again they do have a role to play. What that role exactly is, I mean, I'm not an expert on that side of things. What I would say though is that most governments at some level are, they're excited to have a battery plant, coming in and being developed in Ontario, and I expect that they welcome them with some favorable tax situations. So I think that they already kind of do, because it's in their best interest to build this industry and keep it in Canada. If we're not careful, we could lose this opportunity to capitalize on this vastly different technology, this big change. And you know what, Canada, we are really well positioned with our mining industry and the resources that we have here. We are very well suited to be able to participate actively in this new technology. So I think governments do have a role, and I think that we can talk about whether they're doing enough. Always more is better. And I come back to the climate crisis issue. You think it's serious? If you think it's serious, then you got to put serious money behind it and think of clever ways to incentivize the process.
Tim, I wanted to chat about that, but before I do, another concern coming out of the Deloitte study was charging infrastructure. And I know that EV Society probably gets blasted with these questions about charging infrastructure because it's a big thing. There are many YouTubers who took Ford Mustang Mach-E, for example, which is a non-Tesla electric vehicle, cross country and tried out the Electrify America charging network, which is the non-Tesla owners. That's the charging network that you would use. And of course, lots of problems. So chargers didn't communicate with the vehicle. They charged at a much lower rate. They were waiting for an hour to get up to 20, 30%. They couldn't make it to the next charger. There's many kinks that are being worked out on the charging infrastructure. And in Canada, we have the Flow network that's along the 400 series corridor. I actually went up to Kingston recently, and I wanted to see if the Flow chargers were working, and they were just yellow taped around both, saying like they're out of service. And so that charging infrastructure needs to be super robust. And why do you think it's just not there, and it's not comparable to the Tesla charging network? It seems like it's just miles apart right now. Do you see that gap is going to close anytime soon?
I do believe it will close, but I also concur it exists. I don't have to deal with that, but I know lots of folks who do deal with the non-Tesla charging chargers, and one of the sort of governmental roles that comes to mind here that I know that Electric Mobility Canada is another great organization that supports electrification, and EV Society. One of the questions that they are looking at right now is, shouldn't the government play some role in managing or mandating the I won't say the downtime, but the uptime of these chargers so that they are robust and reliable, particularly if the government is funding, which they do, the installation of a lot of these chargers.
Yes.
So
yes.
That's great. The government's given them money to build a fast charging network, but then they also have to say, well, now you're going to have to maintain it. You can't. It's not just a one-time thing. Now that's government money you've put into work. Make sure that things are working. I do think I think it will improve just through time. I mean, this is still the Wild West for those folks. A lot of different companies involved in building out those chargers. They all speak a slightly different language, kind of pay a different way, and it's not the most convenient. But there is a move afoot, by the way, to a simplified charging network where you just, like Tesla, you just pull it and plug your car in, and it works. You don't have to do anything else. So that's coming. The other thing that is coming that we hear is that Tesla is opening up its vast, fast charging network to other vehicles.
Yeah. And
we don't know when that will happen, but it seems to have started in Europe and it's coming here, according to all the rumors. And that's going to help a lot because Tesla's network is let's face it, it's rock solid.
Yeah. And, I always wonder about that too, because, Tesla's the beneficiary, especially when I was first getting started up under the Obama administration, of large government grants to build out the charging infrastructure to help the company kind of build this electric future. And it kind of rubs me the wrong way that they made those superchargers only work with Tesla vehicles and not have adapters for non-Tesla vehicles. Again, it's just something that I always think about because I do think that there's something kind of nasty about making that proprietary with something that's such a public good.
Well, I think that hindsight can distort things. Remember at the time, Tesla said when they were building that network, that they invited all car companies to use it. They invited them all to join the network, and no one else chose to do it initially because I suspect that the major automotive companies didn't believe that electrification would succeed, and so they really didn't pay much attention to that. I think kind of the opposite. I think if Tesla got some government support at that time, good for the government for doing that, because look where it's led. Do we think electrification would be at where it is today without one startup company sort of stirring the pot and lighting a fire under folks? I don't know.
Tim, it's a fair question. Hindsight is 2020 because had we known that we'd have however many percentage it is now, it's under 10% of all cars are EVs now, but it's still a lot. We probably didn't expect this ramp up this quickly. One of the concerns with that, though, is that going back to the price point, I had Gordon Bauer, a researcher, on talking about EVs and low-income families and individuals and how this will impact them. And to your point earlier, talking about EVs and apartments and condominiums, it's something governments will need to work through. But for many people who are on the lower middle class to low-income spectrum, the thought of an EV is completely out of reach because an entry-level internal combustion engine vehicle may be around $20,000. So the idea of an EV is just totally out of reach for them. Do you see companies like Tesla and other EV manufacturers building vehicles that are at a lower price point in the near future, given the supply chain issues they have right now for their current fleet? I think that this is a much longer term play to get more people adopting EVs, especially in the lower middle class, low income community segment. I hate to say that word, but
yeah. No, well, Christopher, I can't disagree with you about the timeline. I don't know what the timeline is, but I find it hard to imagine that you're going to see a flood of really low cost electric vehicles come onto the market in the next couple of years. Yeah, but what we can see and what we can encourage is because electric cars now are sort of getting up there in popularity, there is a growing used car market, used electric car market. And it's not, it doesn't escape the imagination that you could have an incentive to help folks get into a used electric vehicle. So that's one avenue that could help us in the short term, in the near term. But the only thing that I can hope and pray for is that battery costs and battery technology and battery chemistries, the cost for all of that will continue to fall. We know it's plummeted over the last 12 years. And I suspect strongly that trend will continue. And so what we will see, whether that's 2 years from now or 5 years from now, we're going to see comparable gas and electric cars where the electric car is less money, not even on par. It's going to be less. And as soon as it's less money to buy an electric car than a gas car, I mean, it's kaput for gas, so for combustion, because it's cheaper to buy, and it's cheaper to fuel, and it's cheaper to maintain, and they last longer than the gas component. So, yeah, I wish it would happen faster. I hope it will happen faster, but right now, with the turmoil we see in the market, it's going to be a little while.
One of the common criticisms I hear from friends who own Teslas friends who dislike Teslas and electric vehicles is that they feel like these cars have no soul. So they really like their really fast sports car. They really like hearing that engine roar. They like, feeling the engine below them. As you know, the EV, that's, you don't feel that same connection with the vehicle, or it's different, at the very least. Do you think for those reasons, car enthusiasts especially will always prefer internal combustion engines? They'll always have a place for enthusiasts as well. There's a lot of concern about 18-wheelers going electric. Bill Gates came out criticizing the Tesla truck. Do you think that these are warranted concerns and that there will always be internal combustion engines as a result?
To the last question, no, I don't think there will always be internal combustion engines. There may be a couple of really sideways side cases where a gasoline engine might make sense, but by and large, no, I think they're going to go away. I spent a lot of time, I guess the best analogy I've ever heard, or one of the good ones, is that once upon a time, horses were the most popular means of transportation. They aren't anymore, but people still own them.
Yeah.
But they just don't use them to get to work.
Right.
So the enthusiast will still have their gasoline cars, and I happen to spend a lot of time in my early electric car ownership days going to classic cruise events in Ontario. I used to drive in there and park among all these beautiful restored vehicles, and people would wonder why I was there, and then I'd start to tell them, well, it's special interest, doesn't use gas. And I came to learn that some of the people that didn't like it felt that it was it was a nail in the coffin of their beloved hobby. I was told by one enthusiast that, pretty soon the government's going to, you won't be able to buy gas anywhere, and we won't be able to drive our cars. Gas cars are going to become like cigarettes. You're not going to be able to, enjoy them in public, kind of thing.
Yeah.
But the quick response to that is that the percentage of combustion vehicles that exist that are part of this classic car and collectors hobby is such a tiny percent that who cares? It's not going to affect the climate question. And further to that, they don't drive them on vacation to Florida or other places. They take them out on Sunday on a nice day when they know it's not going to rain and show them off in a farmer's field somewhere. Yeah. This move to electrification is not good. It actually is going to make those car enthusiasts makes their vehicles more valuable, because they're preserving a time in history that we're walking away from now.
Yeah.
don't know if that answers your question or not.
Yeah. And I want to know your answer or your any response you have to the concerns about the Tesla Semi or, big rig trucks, 18-wheelers going electric. There's a lot of concerns about the weight and its range and winter and things like that. What say you to critics who say, this may be a bit too much of a stretch right now?
Well, I would say to that, the market will figure it out. The market will figure it out. I don't know the economics of big rig ownership and use, but I suspect that the maintenance costs of these vehicles and, of course, fuel costs are horrendous. And so maybe the early electric versions of semi-trucks won't have the same range and so won't be applicable or suitable for some long-haul activity. But it's a start. I mean, it's getting there, and it's a foot in the door. And I can only believe it's going to get better and better as battery chemistries and energy density improves.
Mm-hmm.
Heck, they're using them, Christopher, for airplanes, right? Now you're starting to see electric airplanes being used for short haul flights. This is coming. This is there's no stopping it.
Yeah, I think that there's merit, though, when we transition to a new technology. And, the fact that electric vehicles have been around now for 10 plus years, we're building more data about, its performance in all types of weathers and seasons, its towing capacity, its range, all that. We're building that data. And Tesla, almost acts as this hub of data for every single car that it puts on the road as the car sends information back to it. But I still think that there are risks we still don't know about the new technology, even in this kind of 10 years that we have of data, because it's not like as widely adopted. They are heavier, for example. There are safety concerns around that too, because they'll be interacting with lighter vehicles that are gas powered. There's a high reliance on the autonomous driving and the safety features built into many of electric vehicles out of sheer necessity because of its heft and its interaction in urban and dense settings. Again, all of these, an internal combustion engine has to do as well. We just have more and more years of knowledge, and manufacturers know how to make these cars more efficient. That's one thing I always struggle with. Up until the EV revolution, internal combustion engines were on its way to get more efficient as well. And so I think there's still risks that we still don't know with electric vehicles, and only time will kind of help us understand that too.
Well, yeah, I'm not. Again, I would push back a little bit on your comments. I think that from a safety standpoint, I don't think there's any sort of long-term concerns with electric vehicles. I don't see it. The issue of combustion engines becoming more and more efficient, I think if you speak with anybody in a science realm, they would point quickly to the fact that those improvements had all the behavior of diminishing returns. There is only so much that they can do to improve efficiency. And we were, you might be able to reduce it by 10%, but that's not even coming close to the efficiency of even a poorly designed electric vehicle. So I don't think there was a roadmap forward for combustion engines using typical gasoline or diesel fuel. Yeah.
And I know we have limited time left, Tim, but I want to ask you about moving forward. So we're in this inflationary environment now. Cost of living is really high. There are now reports saying that interest rates might go up. Others are saying that, it'll probably stabilize for the rest of the year. It's really hard for consumers and investors as well to know exactly what the next 2, 3, 4 years are really going to play out as. What do you see as some policies and or incentives that governments can do to continue this shift towards electric, thinking about all levels of government, provincial, municipal, and federal?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, some of the things are the possibilities are I think fairly clear. Purchase incentives are a clear opportunity. They're hard to structure sometimes, or a little bit challenging, that you don't want to. In Ontario, for example, there was a great purchase rebate until a change in provincial government came in, and they immediately, ended it, saying that they didn't want to reward millionaires with purchase incentives.
Right.
Well, the point is, you're trying to get a combustion vehicle off the road, and whether that's a fancy combustion vehicle or a standard kind of combustion vehicle, you're getting a combustion vehicle off the road. So it's whatever incentive works, I think, to that goal. The other thing that people have talked about, but I don't think any government has actually done it, and that is to look at potentially waiving the some portion of the purchase sales tax. Whether that's federal or provincial or both. That could be something that in a sense doesn't cost the government money. It certainly reduces some of their taxation, but it's not money that they have to put out to do.
Right.
And not directly, not in my opinion, a huge opportunity, but certainly a welcome one would be if, and this is Ontario, I don't know if this is technically government, but someone like Ontario Hydro could institute super off-peak rates for people who have electric cars.
Right.
So it's already so inexpensive to fuel that I wonder myself whether it would be a big advantage, but it would certainly be a big selling point. It would be an incentive if people knew they could charge their vehicles for next to nothing between 3 and 5 in the morning or something like that. So that's another possibility.
And also, you talked at the beginning about apartment and condo dwellers. The city of Toronto as example, man, it seems like everywhere I bike in the city, it's another condo going up. So if the city and the province can figure out how to incorporate charging in condos in ideally every parking spot, you have that option when you purchase if you would like an electric outlet or not to charge a vehicle. Perhaps that's coming as well, but that could also spur a lot of people, because I know a lot of people where I live choose not to get electric because there isn't a reliable charging infrastructure around them, despite living in a very densely populated area. So you're totally right. Figuring that out, I think, is something governments should do. What do you think? Sorry, go ahead, Tim.
No, go ahead. I was just going to. I forgot my train of thought too. So I was just going to say that. So that worst case scenario is people have to go back to the old standard, but of the gas car model where you have to drive somewhere to refuel and then you come home again, which is kind of not convenient. But
you mentioned also in this podcast that we're still years away from manufacturers making a lower price point EV. Other than that, what else do you think car manufacturers can do to get further along this EV revolution that's happening?
Well, again, car companies, traditional, long-established automotive companies, manufacturers, they're in a difficult spot. I mean, let's face it. They have to. A startup doesn't have to satisfy shareholders. And a startup doesn't have to be concerned about turning off their existing base of customers. But traditional car companies do have to navigate through that. And so I having been in business, I understand that. But it's still, we think it needs to happen, and it needs to happen more quickly than it is. So it's a difficult question. I don't know what those car companies can do that they aren't doing, but they need to be constantly looking at, battery supply is clearly one of the key things. Some folks are getting into the manufacturing end of things. Some are just securing capacity elsewhere and buying their batteries from other companies. I don't pretend to be, an automotive company, but they're going to have to look at those hard choices. And I think they are. I think they are spending the money, and I think they're trying to do the best they can.
It's also tough. Yeah, no, you're totally right. And it's also tough. There was a lot of, just a few years ago before the pandemic, there was a lot of, I remember, hype around many EV startups, NIO being another in China, leading the pack when it comes to electric vehicle adoption. But, once these companies go public on the New York Stock Exchange, Toronto Stock Exchange, investors many times they don't vote with their wallet, they vote with their heart, and they see the future, but they don't anticipate a pandemic. They don't anticipate high inflation, cost of living, and that this roadmap may be more drawn out than what they had anticipated. And now these companies like NIO may be stuck with a lot of cash on their books because so many investors poured money into them, but they can't get the battery tech up to where it needs to be overnight. They can't get the factory up to where it needs to be. They can't hire the workers. That's another, these things we just don't think about. And you being in business, very well, it's a tough place to be in for a lot of EV startups right now.
Yeah. Well, and if the Tesla stories that we hear are any indication, I mean, the amount of cash that's required to start a car company. I mean, when was the last successful new startup in the automotive industry in North America?
Yeah, exactly.
I think it might have been Chrysler. I don't know, but it's going back a long way.
Yeah.
And so Tesla bucked that trend, but all these other folks trying to do it, they've got their work cut out. It's not an easy thing to do. It takes a lot of money.
Yeah, exactly. And that X factor of consumer demand is yeah, it's going to be fascinating. Tim,
well, I think Christopher, I do think that what has been demonstrated so far is that if you build a decent electric car, people want it, especially once they learn about it and once they've experienced it. I don't think demand is going to be part of our concern for a good while. I do respect the fact that folks on a tighter budget are going to have a harder time with this, at least in the initial stages. But long term, it's going to happen.
Tim, I think that's perhaps where we disagree, which is totally fine. I think that when I love watching tech reviews and car reviews as well. And I do find that initially people were really excited about EVs, and they still are. People are, by and large. But there's a lot of things that EV manufacturers, especially the startups like the Rivians, that, you put your money down for an EV and they increase the price on that. And then they, because of public outrage, I think they were forced to walk that back a little bit. I think that there's like a segment of the market that will always want EVs. I think that's fair. I do think for the average consumer who's thinking about switching from their internal combustion engine to an electric, in the case of Rivian, to go from their pickup truck that does everything, takes the kids, picks up the kids, goes to the cottage, does the long haul, all that, to now go electric with Rivian, that's a big leap for those individuals. And that education piece is really important there, but I just don't know if those individuals will switch to an electric EV, an electric pickup that quickly. I think that, again, there's a market for EVs, but I don't know if the average consumer will switch as quickly as governments might hope. Do you sense that?
Yeah. Let me posit this to you then. If any consumer is given a choice between vehicle A and vehicle B, vehicle A is gas, vehicle B is electric. The purchase, let's say that we're down the road a few years, the purchase price is the same.
Sure.
The fuel on the electric is 15 to 20% of the cost of gasoline. The maintenance is a fraction. The lifespan of the electric is, almost double, maybe, depending.
Right.
Now, given those two options, and I mean, the range is getting better. Right now, the range really isn't an issue on a newer vehicle. So given those options, who would buy a gas vehicle? Who would choose that, and why would they choose it?
Yeah, that's a great question, Tim. And I guess what I would respond to that with is there are many fuel-efficient vehicles on the road today. There are plug-in hybrids. There are internal combustion engines that get better fuel mileage than gas guzzlers. There still are gas guzzlers on the road today. And yet people are choosing those. They're still choosing, the tried and true, whatever, Dodge SRT. I mean, someone's going to call me out in the comment section about calling these cars out, but people are still choosing less fuel efficient vehicles despite there being alternatives right now. BMW, I was in a BMW dealership recently, and the salesperson was telling me that it's really hard for them to sell the hybrid X3, which is their entry level SUV. Compact SUVs in Canada are, I think, the number one segment. It's really hard for them to sell it. More people are choosing the fuel alternative. So I totally hear what you're saying. I don't know what consumer demand will be given those two choices, because right now people can choose a better fuel efficient alternative, and still dealerships are struggling with that. So that's the X factor to me. I don't know what consumer demand will be, even if electric vehicles are comparable to, their costs are down, their price points are down. I'm still unsure what consumers will choose.
Well, I'd like to come back and do another podcast with you, and
please,
when the future unfolds, because I just cannot imagine a world where people were going to choose a more expensive vehicle that's costs more to run and maintain, and that won't last as long. I cannot see that happening. But I mean, hey, I don't have a crystal ball.
I honestly, I really hope we do, because I want to keep this as a record, and we can come back to it.
Yeah. Hybrids are an interesting topic.
Yes.
I think we're running out of time, but one of the interesting things I've observed, I've had folks who bought hybrids, and I think hybrids had a place, and maybe they do in very niche situations. They still have a place in remote parts of the country, but often you'll hear someone say that with their hybrid that I've driven for 8 months and the gas engine never came on.
Yeah.
And I go, well, if you didn't have to haul around the weight of a gas engine with the gas and, deal with the maintenance of that, if you didn't have to haul that around, you'd probably have a lot better range than you do. And now you have the maintenance side of it and all the rest. Sure. So a lot of the hybrids that are hard to sell, and I don't know BMW's cars at all. It's because the electric range that they're offering is too low. Yeah, like there are some cars where you get like 50 kilometers of electric range before the gas engine clicks in. Yeah. Well, what's the point of it? Really? Yeah. That's not. Anyway, I can understand why that would be hard to sell.
Yeah. I think it's because they I think it's most Canadians don't do 50 kilometers in a day or whatever. And I think the theory is that you just come home, like you say, just charge it every night, and the 50 kilometers will get you through the next day kind of thing. But you're totally right. We are over time, and that means that this conversation was so exciting. And Tim, you're very passionate about the EV space. I'm so glad I invited you on. I'm so glad to learn more about yourself and what EV Society is doing. This is such a passionate topic, and that's why I wanted to reach out with you. Thanks so much for agreeing to come on and sharing your perspective. I've learned a lot. I'm sure many people have as well. I'll link everything to EV Society in the show notes of this podcast, including the transcript. Thanks for coming on. I'm so excited after this conversation.
Well, Christopher, I really appreciate the opportunity to come on and discuss and debate a little bit. I think it's terrific. And thank you for providing the opportunity.
No problem. Thanks, Tim.